Welcome everyone to the St. Bridget's Day Festival, Vancouver. My name is Eilish Courtney and I am president of the Irish Women's Network of BC. I am truly honored to be your host today. In a moment, I will introduce you to our very special guest speaker, award-winning Irish-Canadian playwright, literary historian, novelist, and screenwriter, Emma Donoghue. But first, as is our practice in British Columbia, we begin by acknowledging the traditional territories where we work and live. I would like to acknowledge that I'm situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and we acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. So the St. Bridget's Day Festival, it's traditionally St. Bridget's Day has been celebrated in Ireland as the beginning of spring and a time of renewal. St. Bridget's Day, of course, is linked to the Celtic festival of Imbolc, heralding the return of spring on February the 1st. The Celtic goddess Breathe was regarded as a goddess of healing, and the ancient Celts acknowledged her on this day as the day that signaled renewal and new growth and escape from darkness. Later, it was Christianized as St. Bridget's Day, which is what we commonly call it today. Since 2018, Irish diplomatic missions have organized a series of events on this day to celebrate the creativity of women. On February the 1st last year, the inaugural St. Bridget's Day Festival Vancouver joined 35 other Irish cultural groups around the world, from Washington to Moscow, to honor Ireland's matriarchal saint. This year in Vancouver, we've been delighted to welcome guests from all around the world for an 8-day festival featuring a series of remarkable and inspiring women. So a bit of housekeeping at the moment. This session is being recorded, and all the sessions, when available online, you'll be notified about that. If you have questions, which I'm sure you will for Emma, please put them in the Q&A, and then we will get to as many as we can after her presentation. So let's find out, just do a quick poll now to see where everyone is calling in from today. And you will see the poll up there now. It could be BC, it could be East Coast, USA, of course, Ireland and the UK, unless you're midnight owls, you're probably not going to be up. And the ever interesting elsewhere. Okay, so we have a few from elsewhere. So obviously most are coming from BC, but can the elsewhere, if you can tell us where elsewhere is, because put it in the Q&A, because we're always curious to know. Thank you for that. And so now to our guest speaker. I'm truly delighted to welcome Emma Donoghue to the St. Bridget's Day Festival, Vancouver, to share with us the photographs that inspired her best-selling novel, The Pull of the Stars. Born in Dublin in 1969, Emma is the youngest of 8 children of Frances and Dennis Donoghue, the literary critic. Like many of us Irish, she attended Catholic convent schools in Dublin. She earned a first-class honours BA in English and French in 1990 from University College Dublin, and then in 1997, she earned a PhD from the University of Cambridge. After years of commuting between England, Ireland, and Canada, in 1998, she settled in London, Ontario, where she now lives with her family. From the age of 23, she has earned her living as a writer. The Pull of the Stars is her 13th novel and her 17th book of fiction. And on publication in July 2020, it became a New York Times bestseller in the US, as well as a bestseller in Canada, Ireland, and Britain. Of course, many of us know Emma from her novel, Room, which was shortlisted for the Man Booker and Orange Prizes and has sold over 2 million copies. She adapted it into her first feature film, Room, directed by Lenny Abrahamson, which was nominated for 4 Academy Awards for Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Director, Best Picture, and Best Actress, which was won by Brie Larson. Emma has recently adapted Room for the stage with songs by Cora Bissett and Catherine Joseph, but unfortunately the North American premiere had to be put on hold due to the pandemic. Her other works include short story collections, stage and radio plays, literary history, as well as fiction for young readers. As I mentioned, today Emma will present the photographs that inspired her novel, The Pull of the Stars. Set in Dublin during the Great Flu pandemic in 1918, it is about a nurse midwife, a doctor, and a volunteer helper living through 3 days in a maternity quarantine ward. I read Emma's book during a short getaway this summer and I could not put it down. It was totally gripping in terms of the graphic description of a maternity ward at the turn of the century, but also because of the strong female characters it portrayed. Against the backdrop of the Spanish flu, the end of World War I, home rule in Ireland, sexism in the workplace, and the treatment of women and children by church and society. I'd like to share just a couple of lines from reviews I read about the book that really resonated with me. Australian Women's Weekly said, at its heart, this is a story about friendship, love, and compassion in extraordinary times. It's an engrossing read. Donoghue's writing is visceral, and her female characters strike a powerful chord of humanity that stays with you. And then the Sunday Post, Business Post, said there's sadness aplenty, but also a little love and hope amid the body count. And the book flies by like a hospital shift as drama follows crisis and victory chases tragedy in a never-ending cycle of suffering, joy, and body fluids. On that note, it is now my great pleasure to welcome Emma Donoghue.
Hello all, I'm delighted to have been invited to do this by the Bridget's Festival, and thanks very much, Eilish, for that lovely introduction. You know, it's great fun for me tonight. I've done so many general chats about the book, which has received way more attention than it would have if it hadn't been for its coincidental timing. But I've very rarely been able to sort of bring people behind the scenes and actually talk through some of the more technical inspirations for it. So it's lovely to be doing a slideshow tonight, a very different format. I should start by saying, by the way, even though this seems like a COVID novel, it was, in fact, I started writing it in 2018, inspired by an article in The Economist magazine about the centenary of the Great Flu pandemic. And so I wrote it as a historical novel, but, you know, of course, with relevance to today, but that was pre-COVID today. And then I delivered the final draft of the book in March. It was meant to come out this month, so almost a full year later. And at that point, my publisher said, you know, it's about a pandemic, maybe we should bring it out this summer. So I was extremely startled by that, as you'd imagine, because usually there's a good long stretch, typically more than a year between, you know, doing your last bit of serious work on a book and having it actually come out. So I was a bit startled to see that they can, in fact, bring it out in a couple of months if everyone really gets the head down, you know. So I was very lucky, by the way, in the copy editing. One reason they managed to do it so fast and well was because my copy editor at Little Brown in New York is an emergency room doctor as well. She divides her time. So she was literally going between COVID patients and my text. And I also hired a midwife to give the midwife's point of view as well, since that's a different kind of, you know, medical tradition on childbirth. I mean, very basically, the reason I wrote this novel set in a maternity ward is that when I was reading initially about the flu pandemic, one of the tiny things that captured my imagination was that the people who were most liable to catch that awful variant of the flu were women in late pregnancy or just after giving birth. And they were the ones most likely to have horrendous side effects. So I thought that was such an interesting kind of, you know, knot of two different medical dramas, you know, two quite separate medical storylines, and that your flu could be mild, but the birth could go terribly wrong, or vice versa. So I thought, oh yes, I've got to write a novel that in whatever ward they would put those patients who were both in labor and had the flu. I couldn't work out, I never found, in fact, a source telling me where they put those women, but they couldn't logically have stuck them in the ordinary labor ward or the ordinary flu ward. So I imagined a tiny little 3-bed ward where a Dublin hospital, which was very much aimed at women of the slums, might have put with women. And I thought if it's that small, it could be run by one woman. So I had my heroine, Julia Power. So yeah, I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Can Eilish, can everything be heard all right? Am I all right? Okay, great. I'm going to share my, I'm just checking. I wouldn't want to blab away for an hour with some major, flaw. So I'm going to share my screen now and start showing you my photos. Now, I've drawn on photos for any novel since any novel set later than about the 1840s. Photos are such an evocative source. Um, but I have to say, photos have a special role in The Pull of the Stars because it's been described as the first pandemic that was fully documented in photographs. So it's remarkable how much we rely on photographs for those sort of fleeting impressions of what life was like then and what the pandemic was like. So some of these photos I managed to find myself. Others were found for me by my dear friend Margaret Lonergan of Jackdaw Studio in Dublin. She did the picture research and cleaned up the images and above all found out where they were from and which ones were authentic and so on. Because on the internet, there's a lot of, vague attributing of sources out there and photos that, there's one very glamorous image, for instance, of two women in these beautiful masks walking along the street. And that's routinely given as an image of the 1918 pandemic. And in fact, it was a fashion shoot from about 1906, wearing kind of exotic harem style gauzing over the face, So it's good to have some, reliably sourced images. So this first one just shows you Dublin circa 1900. And one thing I'd like you to notice is there's still horse-drawn carriages, but also there's electric wiring overhead. So we're sort of between two worlds there. It's a world very modern in some ways, and that's one main reason why I thought the 1918 pandemic would be so interesting to write about, is that they were living very modern lives in busy cities, just like us, and yet everything had to grind to a halt. So I had this very vivid impression early on that if I wrote a novel about the 1918 flu, it would almost have a post-apocalyptic atmosphere of, modern life, but terrified of invisible germs, a weird mixture of the old and the new. Here on the right, we have the beautiful old 18th century Parliament Dublin had, which in 1918, of course, had no political power because all the power was happening in Westminster, which is one main reason why Dublin became such a slum city, because of the Act of Union at the start of the 19th century, basically all the power and the money switched over to Britain. So this is the building on the right is now, well, actually I was going to say it's now a bank, but I'm probably out of touch. It's probably something else since. Not only is my novel set during the pandemic, but it's set during the war. An appalling overlap of the two, and the war must have contributed to the spread of that terrible flu variant, though nobody's quite sure why. So here we have a bit of recruitment propaganda targeting the Irish in particular. Look, the fellow on the left is meant to be showing the real Irish spirit, and then you have the Irish woman on the right guilt-tripping her man. And notice the hint that he'd be mortified and shamed at the idea that she would go for him. So they were calling on deep gender stereotypes to get those Irish men to sign up voluntarily. And in my novel, I decided I didn't want the war to crowd in too much, but I did, of course, want to show the reality of it. So I decided that Julia Power, I didn't want her living in a big nurse's residence. There'd be so many characters to keep track of. I thought I'd have her living with her brother. So her brother is a veteran of the war and quite damaged by it. He doesn't speak. So her brother was a lovely challenge to me of how to write a character without any actual dialogue and yet still evoking him and his warmth and his friendship for his sister very vividly by acts like, he buys a barn brack and he keeps the dinner warm for when she's going to be home that night. Here are what some of the Irish soldiers were going through if they did volunteer for the war. This is the 16th Irish Division. This is a photo from the Imperial War Museum showing something it would be exaggerating to say total wasteland that they are walking through. Talk about a post-apocalyptic atmosphere here. You wouldn't know what planet you're on. It's a splintered looking world. Here's one in which an Irish regiment called the Fighting 69th, they were in a dugout near Luneville in France in 1918. This image was kept and taken by the US Army. And the sheer claustrophobia of this image, that's one thing I was trying to capture in my novel, because I had a feeling that, women's lives have very often been too confined and, rather than say too free. And in particular, childbirth was often called confinement because you had to stay home for, say, a 6-week period in the 18th century. So the idea of women's lives taking place in this claustrophobic setting, which would be their sort of equivalent of the appalling trenches and dugouts that so many men were living in. I thought a birthing womb with all its, blood and risk and heroism would be a sort of a female equivalent of that male wartime experience. There's a character in my novel. I suppose one thing I'm trying to show you is that photographs wouldn't be just background to research. They wouldn't just let me say, oh, look, the war was terrible, but they would often give me very specific ideas. So in my novel, I wanted to show some of the damage done by the war, but without having to talk about the war a lot. And I decided that having one of the orderlies, the men who, wheeled patients around in the hospital, he's mockingly called by the nurses Noseless Nichols. I decided he would be a man like the one on the left who has a metal face prosthetic. An American sculptor called Anna Coleman Ladd pioneered the creation of these pretty amazing for their time facial prosthetics. So this photo is from the Library of Congress. And this image here shows that, of course, not everyone in Ireland was gung-ho for the war at all. And one of my main characters is from the sort of revolutionary tradition. So here's a big banner hung up at the union, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, and they've hung up the banner, "We serve neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland." And I think one thing that drew me to setting this novel in Ireland is that there was such an interesting political tension going on. In the middle of the war and the pandemic, there was also such massive political change in Ireland in that, I'm going to generalize here, but in 1916, most people seem to have been utterly taken aback by the Easter Rising, and yet 3 years later, they voted a majority Sinn Féin government. So I just can't imagine any political events that would, change the minds of me and my friends all at once in a mere 3 years. So it was clearly an extraordinary time, and the disruption of the pandemic must have been some of that. So that picture, by the way, is unknown source. Now we have what's now O'Connell Street in Dublin. It was Sackville Street then. And these stylish women in the front are marching on past this gaping hole caused by the 6-day Easter Rising. This image belongs to Trinity College in Dublin. And one thing I love about this picture is the sense of people just getting on with their lives. There's 6 days of shooting and hundreds of people dying in the street, but then you just carry on with your life, even though there's a huge, great gaping hole in the middle of the street. And of course, because this was during the war, it took a very long time for any of these signs of visible damage to be patched up again. So they were really living in a visibly war-torn city. So Julia Power, my nurse midwife heroine, she's going to work on streets like these with just, appalling damage and that there's no chance of fixing yet till after the war. So nobody has a chance to forget, put it that way. Here's a close-up on that gaping hole. This image is from the National Library of Ireland and the National Archives. And you see that the hole is right beside the General Post Office, where, when I was a kid, my parents would always point out the bullet holes in that one. I decided that I could set my novel in any hospital, but that it would be most interesting maybe if I focused on hospitals that served the women of the slums, because Dublin was said to have the worst slums east of Bombay then. It was a particularly poor city and a particularly poor country, and the Irish birth rate was, I can only say, appallingly high. So, the sheer number of children crowding the scene, I think, shows you why, to give you one fact of the time, a baby had less chance of surviving its first year in Dublin than a soldier in the trenches might have. So, the father might go over to war and he might survive that first year in the trenches better than the baby at home, simply because of the housing conditions. Some of you may know that in Dublin there were a lot of old 18th century houses which had gradually fallen into ruin. My first taste of any of this was some Sean O'Casey plays I'd have seen at the Abbey and the Gate Theatre in Dublin, in which houses would have become, these weird multi-family microcosms where you'd have entire families each living in one room. And O'Casey's play The Plough and the Stars is one reason why my book is called The Pull of the Stars. And the other literary source is Roddy Doyle's superb novel, A Star Called Henry. And the third reason for the title is that influenza literally means the influence of the stars on human health. It was an Italian word. And I loved the idea that I could, Dublinize this concept a bit by calling it, the pull of the stars, as if the stars were just reaching down out of sheer malice or divilment and kind of yanking on us for their amusement, you know. Anyway, these are 3 pictures in a row, all from 1913 from the Royal Society of Antiquaries. In this first one in Chancery Lane, I suppose what I want to emphasize is the sheer number of children. In my novel, I decided to make up a proverb because sometimes you find lots of evidence, but not put snappily enough. Novelists very rarely, you know, find new stuff. We're not usually original researchers, but we put things as snappily as we can. So I decided to make up a proverb for the women in the hospital ward to tell each other, which is, "She doesn't love him unless she gives him 12." And I thought, as a 8th child of 8, I had the right to do a bit of mocking about that that kind of mindset. The second picture is from a street called the Coombe, and it shows a room so dilapidated, I think it would be fair to say it's like a crime scene. No family are shown in it. It's almost as if they'd be ashamed to be on camera. You know? Here's one from Francis Street that not only has a little shy child in filthy clothes in the doorway, but in the bed, I think there might be a child sleeping there too, or maybe sick. And one thing that moves me so much is the little prints up on the wall, you know, the little attempt to gentrify or make respectable a room that is absolutely squalid. I find that deeply moving. This is a very interesting photo. It's called Three Shawleys. And notice it's not just the 3 mothers, but children too. There's a boy in the foreground who's holding another child. This picture was taken by Mrs. Charles O'Connor for the Lady of the House magazine. And at first I thought, oh, here we have, you know, a posh woman getting some poor women to pose for her, and she's really just sort of being voyeuristic. But I looked into it more, and her photograph was taken to go with an article called "The Last of a Historic Dublin Slum." And the article was written by Mary Costello, who was a very progressive novelist and journalist. So also Mrs. Charles O'Connor, the photographer, turns out that she was the wife of an Irish judge who was so good that after the Irish Revolution, you know, the new state kept him on as a judge. He was so well respected. So I realized that for Mary Costello to write this article about the Dublin slums in where's the year? 1901, yes, and Mrs. Charles O'Connor to take this picture to go with it. They were sort of like people who retweet a viral video of police violence today. They were doing their best to draw attention to poverty and overcrowding and to give some kind of representation to these women and children who, by the way, are, I love their expressions. They're very tough. They're not grateful. They're, you know, they're willing to show themselves and their slum to the camera, but they're not, you know, playing up to the camera. They're not being cute or amenable. It's a very accusing look, I would say, especially those 2 women on the right. So this photo was one that really got under my skin. I think because what this photo shows me is that if you're going to write about other people's suffering, and you're going to give your readers a bit of a kind of almost voyeuristic thrill about like, oh, what horrible times they lived through, these poor women, you have a duty to get the tonal balance right so that you're not just saying like, oh, terrible, stinky times they were, but you're really making the readers think about their lives and their times. So, you know, a novel, just like a photograph, has to have a sort of ethical duty to do the right thing with the information it's showing. You can't be just trying to give a little shiver to your readers, you know. So now we come to hospitals. Here's a sort of before picture. It's from a hospital in Brisbane. This is from the State Library of Queensland, and this shows a kind of a baseline of how orderly and calm hospitals were generally. Then they had very sort of military, what's the word, hierarchy to them. There was a huge emphasis on neatness, calm, organization. I mean, I used training manuals for nurses and midwives, and very little of them is about medicine. Almost all of it is about, you know, being prompt, being calm, being formal. You were not meant to tell patients your name, for instance. You were above all meant to kind of, you know, not overstep those boundaries. For instance, books on midwifery, which doctors would write for midwives, they had this sort of stern tone where the doctor would say, you know, here's a diagram of the cervix, but, you know, don't get carried away and start trying to do your own diagnosis or make your own medical decisions. You know, this diagram is just here so that you'll understand enough to go running for a doctor. There was a huge amount of trying to keep nurses and midwives in their place. Here's a posed photo from 1904 of Dr. Basil Hood in Charing Cross, and of course an unnamed nurse. And notice how differentially she's looking at him. And he went on to keep a very detailed diary of his practice during the Spanish flu pandemic. But one thing I really like in this photo is how it captures the aura of power around a doctor. And in my novel, Julia Power is constantly having to negotiate with these different doctors. Some of them aren't even experts in gynecology, because of course the hospitals were so understaffed during the pandemic. Your colleagues would be falling sick or dropping dead. So of course Julia is sometimes dealing with young doctors who do not know a thing about the female reproductive system really, and yet she's having to very much play it tactfully so that they won't call her insubordinate. This picture is from the Fever Hospital in Dublin from 1903. And one thing it shows is that nurses were always having to do a variety of tasks that nowadays would be done at the lab or in the kitchens or in the laundry room. Here they are, making up medicines, and they were also supposed to make up food for their patients sometimes. It was the books on nursing. It's unimaginable how they managed to do everything in the time available to them, because it'll say something like, and your patient will like a milk tea or barley broth or something, and you realize she was meant to be making that up in the corner over a Bunsen burner. Births mostly happened at home, of course. If a woman was giving birth in hospital, it was usually a sign that something was very wrong. Now, one thing I found interesting is that I had sort of assumed that the attitude back then would have been like it was, frankly, in Ireland when I was a teenager in the 80s and 90s, save the mother and the child equally. We even voted a bit into our constitution about that. But actually, no, back in 1918, it was so difficult to save the child if anything went wrong in birth, that there was very little emphasis on trying to save the child. Partly because if you got a baby out very early, there was so little you could do. Here we see a very basic incubator, a warm box. But there was, they were not yet able to keep alive very delicate babies the way we are now. And so all the emphasis was on save the mother. The idea was she can always have another baby. She's the baby making machine, so save the mother. So this brings us to the 1918 flu pandemic. Here's an image of a giant truck of coffins in San Francisco. It's hard to find out exactly how many died, because of course it really depended where in the world you were, but roughly it is thought between 3 and 6% of the human race died. And the worst areas were Asia and Africa. So I didn't set the pull of the stars in Ireland because it was especially bad there, not at all. It was just that it was home territory to me, and as I said, politically very interesting time as well. So the photographer of this image is Christopher Helen. I used a lot of propaganda at the time. So here we have a catchy rhyming poster from the US Public Health Service. And I made up little rhyming signs for the Irish government to paste up on billboards and so on in my novel. Again, I was trying to make things catchier and more compact, and bring a kind of a dark humor in as well, because looking at government information in 1918, not just in Ireland, but all over the world, I found it sort of surreal how bad much of the advice was, because clearly governments wanted to calm people down and keep the economy going. And so they would give completely false reassurance about how, the epidemic is well in hand, or, only defeatists will catch this illness. There was a huge amount of victim blaming. They would say things like, if you feel a symptom, lie down and have yourself nursed for 2 weeks, which would really only be relevant if you were a duchess. And so you can imagine this year, when I was doing my copy editing on this novel and also reading the headlines about COVID, how much I was struck by a similarity and a tendency to, in every era, lie about the facts, and above all, blame the victims and make it seem like it was people's own fault if they caught this illness. There was also a lot of xenophobia, just as, say, Trump tried to have people call COVID the Wuhan virus, and back then, and even since, this particular flu has often been known as the Spanish flu. You see in this picture, we have a sort of evil Spaniard being blamed. And this was simply because the Spanish government was not involved in World War I. It was neutral, so they could be honest about the fact that many of their politicians had the flu, including their king, when countries like Germany and England were busy lying and saying, no, we don't have a flu problem, we are perfectly strong and our morale is high. So that's the only reason it's known as the Spanish flu. And so I always call it the Great Flu. And in fact, it seems to have originated in Kansas. Back then, they were particularly nervous about people spitting, which my sense is less of a big deal these days, but also kissing. There was a lot of advice on how to kiss safely through handkerchiefs. I don't know if we kiss less nowadays, but that was a real preoccupation back then, was the kissing. Here's an Irish cartoon from an Irish paper. You notice the insect-like flu is turning up again, and the common people are begging, for goodness sake, don't let them in. This was the third wave of the flu. What I love about these cartoons, you know, frankly, even the ones that are xenophobic or ignorant, I love the fact of the humor, you know, the fact that even in times of horror, you know, people still want a bit of a laugh. So they often have a very strange combination of humor and political content. You see here that people will always try to make a buck. So just as, you know, Etsy, now 10% of what Etsy sells is handmade masks. Similarly, Horlicks was trying to sell itself here as a sustaining food endorsed by physicians everywhere during the Great Flu. This is a soldiers' hospital in Kansas, and Kansas, as I said, is where we now think that particular terrible flu began in the spring of 1918. You see how ad hoc this is, the camp beds. It's not at all like those pre-flu hospital pictures with their aura of calm. This is a nurse taking a pulse, and notice her sort of improvised mask there. And this is a flu ward at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. And notice that they're using open air because they had a general sense that air was good for respiratory problems. But it's also probably that they hadn't the space inside. And you notice they're hanging up sheets between their patients as some kind of basic attempt to do physical distancing, as we call it now. Here we have a picture where the staff are blurred because it's not a posed picture at all. It's a flu ward in Oakland, California. And here they don't even have partitions between those beds. It's really very basic. There's no curtains. You see nurses crouching, adjusting their masks, carrying bundles of laundry. The whole thing looks very, you know, feverish. And many of these nurses could be volunteers at this point. And I was sure early on that I needed to include a volunteer in the Pull of the Stars, because a lot of women who had never nursed or worked in charities before, the flu pandemic was their moment that sort of pulled them out of the drawing rooms. And many of them looked back with a weird kind of nostalgia on the episode as like the first time they felt really needed and necessary. And there was even one volunteer who she volunteered at a hospital. She died of the flu 6 days later, and she said that this had been the best week of her life. So I was deeply struck by that. And so I was trying to capture some of that atmosphere of, you know, highly trained people working in hospitals, but also some complete newbies. And of course, a newbie is a gift to a novelist, because the newbie sees everything fresh and asks the questions like, you know, why are we giving the patients whiskey, for instance? That was considered the safest drug for them, because aspirin would bring down fever, but aspirin in really high doses could sometimes kill the patients. So I decided to include a volunteer helper in my novel, that I would have a nurse, a doctor, and a volunteer helper to show that full range, the kind of web of healthcare workers keeping people alive in hospitals. That, you know, in their different ways, just as we see nowadays, it's not just the you know, respiratory expert you rely on, it's the cleaner, it's the one who brings in the food, it's the people making the masks. So this poster from the Red Cross makes it into my novel. Julia glimpses it in the cafeteria and feels a stab of guilt, because it's really very to the gut, isn't it? If I fail, he dies. And I think an image like this shows you that the propaganda aimed at nurses really was coming straight out of that tradition of, you know, guilt tripping of women as mothers and wives already. You know, like, it's your fault if your child is eating badly or is not clean. It's your fault if he dies. This is very emotive language. Here we have an example of how these nurses sometimes wore masks, sometimes didn't. It's not always clear to me. The picture shows nurses and kitchen staff, so it could be that the nurses have the masks and the kitchen staff don't. But masking was really inconsistent then anyway. They did a lot more of it in North America than in Europe. And quite often they would wear masks when they were outside in the street, but then they would take them off as they were going into a building. So, you know, we now would say that that was probably worse than useless. Here's another example from London of nurses having to do a bit of everything themselves. They are collecting pillows from the truck, literally. They don't have, you know, staff for all this. And many supplies, of course, ran out. So they were using a lot of moss in wounds, and they ran out of cotton early on. So they were using flax tow swabs instead of cotton. Women got a lot of paramedical jobs, such as this Red Cross Motor Corps in Missouri. And they're in roles here that you would have expected men to be in. This is a startling image of the kind of new freedoms for women in this time of grueling necessity. I mean, their skirts are barely below the knees. It's a very paramilitary look. And it's an example of how, you know, when the men were away, the women got to do a lot of jobs that they would never have got before. Here's a similar station in Washington, D.C. And of course, it's very hard to distinguish between nursing and welfare work. Just as even though Julia in the novel is not actually in the homes of her slum patients, she's acutely aware of how much they were coming to hospital and they were coming to the flu with their histories already weakened by, for instance, their appallingly high birth rate and their lack of nutrition and tainted milk and so on. So, you know, the middle class woman in her ward is at least perfectly healthy before the flu hits her, whereas one woman in Julia's ward already has one really swollen leg since the last time she gave birth. So in this image, what we see is the Red Cross nurses bringing food to a family whose mother has just died, bringing, you know, care out into the community rather than waiting for people to come to hospital. And this photo made me wonder about whether we have stats on race in 1918, you know, in terms of who the flu hit. And I don't know any stats for them then, but I think COVID has certainly proved to us that there's nothing, you know, neutral or universal about a virus, that it hits those who have been hit hard already, and it hits those who are down, who, you know, a phrase I've learned this year is the social determinants of health. So this photo reminded me of, for instance, I saw a map of where COVID was hitting in Toronto, which is near where I live in London, Ontario. And, you know, you could see the virus was mapping almost exactly onto indices like immigrants, people of color, what's the word? Don't mean claustrophobic, like crowded dwellings, people facing jobs, that kind of thing, lack of access to doctors. So this image, wear a mask or go to jail. As I was saying, mask wearing was not universal then, but it was certainly a source of quarrels even then. Here's an image of women clerks in New York. During World War I, everybody was aware of women in new fields like transport, because you'd literally have them collecting your ticket on the bus. But in fact, the really big move was women into office jobs. So here are clerks working in very crowded conditions with their improvised masks on. This one is simply called Workers from 30th of November. We've no idea who they were. And this one is called Women Wearing Masks. And I love their stare. I remember an article from early on during COVID saying, you know, the mask means women don't have to smile all the time. You know, I think of that when I look at these women, and that sense of kind of urgency and importance about their work. And this photo inspired me so much that I put it straight into the book, even though it's a photo from London. I was so intrigued by the kind of little neat beak-like, bird-like masks that I decided to have Julia glimpse that couple from her tram. And this shows some of the ways in which people improvised with masks. These are sisters in Australia. They used other measures, like they would get soldiers to gargle with salt water. And here we are back in Dublin, and this photo reminds me of the sheer damp of the conditions that Julia's Dublin patients would have been living in even before it hit. So, you know, all those government notices saying, keep things clean, you know, don't let rubbish build up. and seek out fresh air and sunshine. You know, I look at this image and I think, okay, try raising your family of 12 in one of those cottages, and where are you meant to get the fresh air and the sunshine? This is one particular victim of the flu in Dublin, Catherine Heatley. She's daughter of a blacksmith, and she married a trunk maker and had their first baby 12 days after the wedding. I had 3 babies, 3 years. And then Charlie, her husband, went off to the Somme, where on the first day of the Somme, a man died every 4.4 seconds. And he went missing, took a year for her to hear that he died. And then she herself died of the flu, leaving her 3 small boys. And the British Army offered to raise them in an orphanage, and the families said, no, thanks very much. Which brings me to one of my last topics, which is Irish residential institutions. There've been a lot in the news these days. When I was writing the book, I drew a lot on the Ryan report on residential institutions, and then more recently we've seen the mother and baby one. I decided to have one of the key patients in the novel be a woman, an unwed mother, as they would have called her, from a mother and baby home, who's going straight back there after. And the kind of protocol was, this wasn't actual law, it was just a practice, that you would have to stay 1 year to work off the costs of your birth. But if you were like a hardened case, as they call them, if this was your second time having a baby outside marriage, you would have to stay 2 years. So this was a kind of informal judicial system. This particular house is Bethany House in Dublin. Very low staffing, I noticed, so you get a lot of babies tied into rocking chairs, and also notice an older girl to the left who's clearly doing some of the childcare. Here is the famous setting of the film Philomena, Ross Abbey in Ross Grey, where there's an angel's plot in which an unknown number of babies died. And again, you have children here taking part in the childcare, and you also have lay staff. Notice there are nuns on the sides, but there are lay staff there. And in the Ryan report, which I drew on in detail, the only time I've ever used a government report as a source for a novel, but that talked a lot about much of the abuse being done by lay staff because the nuns were off back at the convent at night. So it's not about nuns being monsters. I was educated very well by nuns. It's about institutions which are set up in such a way, very low staff ratios, very little supervision, and very little focus on the child. So institutions which enabled and encouraged adult cruelty to children. This one is the infamous Chewham mother and baby home. And here we have one of the Magdalen laundries, which were another part of what Bridie, the volunteer in my novel, calls the pipe, like the sort of the pipeline of institutions. Here we have really children using massive equipment, making a lot of money for the Catholic orders who ran them. These photos just give me the shivers. One of the moments that I give Julia and Bridie to cheer up in the novel is that I let them fangirl over Mary Pickford, a film star of the day. So here's a Mary Pickford film. And I'm going to finish with just a few photos of Kathleen Lynn, who I tried to keep out of my novel in that I didn't want any real historical characters. You know, they're a lot of trouble. It's easier to make them up. So I was just doing background research on doctors of the time, but I come across Kathleen Lynn, who is down here in the front row. She was in Cumann na mBan, Irish paramilitary organization, the Women's Council in Irish, and she was involved in the 1916 Rising. She was a passionate labor rights activist, trade unionist, she met her beloved partner, Madeleine French Mullen, here we see front left. She met her when they were both working for Belgian refugees. They were suffragettes, and ultimately they were revolutionaries as well. And Kathleen Lynn turned out to be so perfect for my novel that I couldn't actually manage to keep her out of it. So she's in the very first draft of the book, she was just given a fictional name, and I try and keep her politics at bay. But then by the second draft, she's really stepped forward. Here she is in the 1930s. One reason I had to include her in my book is that she was actually on the run from police and working with flu patients during the period that my novel is set in the autumn of 1918. So I decided I found this an irresistible combination. The idea of this doctor who's literally being hunted by police, but still, you know, that can't stop her doing her doctoring. Kathleen and Madeline, who they spent their lives together in Rathmines in Dublin. They're usually shown in photos with at least one person between them, but in this one, they're side by side. And in this one, Madeline on the left has a kind of a rakish wink going on. They dreamed of setting up a children's hospital specifically, and they did indeed, by May 1919, manage to do it. They started with a little 2-bed hospital in this old shooting hall building you see here on Charlemont Street in Dublin. You see they have the name of it in Irish. It's St. Alton's Hospital. And Madeline French Mullen funded it and was the administrator. It was an extraordinary hospital where Kathleen Lynn hired women as doctors and nurses, but non-denominational. She didn't care if they were Catholic or Protestant. And she kept goats for fresh milk. And she had beds on the roof to give children air. And she would arrange holidays for their mothers while they were sick. So here's a wonderful, messy image of doctors and nurses and patients at St. Alton's. Here she is with 4 of the tiny malnourished babies who came to her. One thing St. Alton's did was it pioneered BCG vaccination in Ireland and ultimately was responsible for the state's BCG, so anti-tuberculosis vaccination. And in my mother's diaries recently, I came across the fact that in 1970, I was brought in to St. Alton for my own vaccination. So it gave me a wonderful little shiver to think that even though I never met Dr. Lynn, I went in for my vaccination. There we go. I feel as if I have you all sitting here and I'm like literally looking through, sheaves of photos together saying, and here's another bit, trying to give you a sense of the slightly obsessive quality to immersing yourself in a time and place to write a novel like this one.
Emma, it's been fantastic. I'm like just taking it all in because, and you answered all my questions. I mean, I was going, but there was so much in your book, when it was sort of first advertised, it was like, oh yes, it's about the Great Flu, but it's not. That's the backdrop. It's really about the women, and of course, as an Irish woman too, and we're all very raw at the moment too, with the mother and baby report coming out in January, and reading the book last summer, and thinking about that. So. Yeah, I think it had a lot of impact in that regard too, because for a lot of people, and I mean, and the impact of the church and the on women particularly. So I think definitely as women, as I said, I think it really, it's a book that spoke to me, and I did find it. I smiled at myself even because I'm not into gory things, and your descriptions of childbirth were quite. That's why I like that review about bodily fluids, because it was like, yes, but it caught me, it gripped me, and
one reason I did that is that we've all had a stubbed toe or we've all had a cut finger, right? So you don't need to explain things like that. And again, war, you might say we haven't all been blown up by a grenade, but frankly, we've read so much from the point of view of men at war, and we've seen so many shootings and bombings. That's all fairly guessable. Childbirth is a mysterious area, to all the people in the world, women included, who haven't given birth, and it's shrouded in secrecy. So to me, there was no way I could be sort of veiled or euphemistic about childbirth. I had to give the information, and also I was basically saying none of this is a source of shame. I was really trying to dignify the hard work it is.
Well, and you're right, it is. And I have a number of nursing friends, and I so value, and of course we all value the work that they're doing at the moment, but also they are very, the work that they do is incredible. And the whole idea, you mentioned it in your presentation too, about the doctors being so much more superior. I hope we've moved away from that. I don't know that we have quite yet. Listening to some of my nursing friends, but let's look at some questions. I see questions indeed popping in here.
Okay, let's stay with the book first. And very interesting. What interesting reference to whether there's any sport in the novel. And just like now, everything was shut. So I have, for instance, lots of signs up that that Julia sees as she goes to work, sporting fixtures postponed for the duration. And just like us, they thought it would be short term, and then the postponements just went on and on. So most things were really shut down.
Yeah.
I would say cinemas were a key form of entertainment for people. So, you know, the government did not shut them because nobody had Netflix to go home to. So one of the nun nurses in the novel is, you know, furious with people lining up outside the kind of germ pit of the cinema, but I can quite see why they would, you know. Now, Donal asks, what effect did the flu have on the events and outcomes of the Irish Revolution? I have to say that would be difficult for me to give an answer to. I couldn't help feeling that it must have been part of what changed so many minds during that sort of period of 1916 to 19.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't as simple as, oh, we've had a terrible flu, therefore we must vote out this British government. It was more, I think, an overall atmosphere of, you know, things are changing so much. Yeah. This is a time of extraordinary change, like sort of the ground is shifting under our feet. So I don't think the flu told anyone who to vote for, but I think it's probably, you know, last roughly May when we were, say, going on Black Lives Matter marches and so on, I remember thinking, you would expect during a pandemic, people would just panic and hunker down. But no, actually, these things politicize people because they start seeing their own society as if lit up by a terrible X-ray. They start to see the deep flaws, the inequalities in healthcare, for instance. Mm-hmm. So they're actually more able to grasp the fact that there's a problem with the status quo than they would be during good times. So that's all I can suggest. But I'm really not a historian, so I can't say how it contributed to the revolution. But it certainly felt like this was all part of the mix that made it more possible to then imagine a different way of running Ireland, you know. And certainly people like Kathleen Lynn, it's not that they started out as revolutionaries, it's more that she was so aware of everything that was wrong around her, basically the baby's starving and dying. And this led her kind of step by step through, you know, labor rights and suffragism, and then ultimately, you know, let's have our own government and try and run things better.
Yeah, she was an amazing, I learned about her through your book and then had to go and look her up and learn more. She's a phenomenal woman. And a little side thing, I believe that there's a bit of a petition to try to get the new children's hospital in Dublin named after her.
I heard that, and it would seem so appropriate because when she set up St. Ultan's as this little small, you know, hospital, she did go to some senior Irish cleric and say, like, you know, let's have a national children's hospital, let's combine our resources. And he was like, oh, no, we would want a Catholic ethos. So he had no interest in some bipartisan, let's save the children thing, not a bit. So given that she was really spurned by the Irish establishment, by the Catholic establishment, I think it would be so perfect if they named it for her now, you know?
I think we need to push that one along. And
okay, question about Julia.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Julianne Bridie, which I'll try not to answer in too much detail, given that everyone hasn't read it. But what I would say is that I was aware from the start that, first of all, I had to have some sources of joy and surprise and hope in this novel. You know, there's a limit to how much your readers can take. So I'm always acutely aware of the balance between light and dark, not just in a novel overall or what the ending would be, say, but even on any given page, you know, you need the little flickers of humor. And I was also aware that I had a situation where my characters could meet each other for the first time and meet each other's lives by 3 days later, because, you know, the sheer speed of the bonding between people in hospitals, just like the men in the trenches, you know, total strangers came to really deeply love each other. So it seemed to make sense for, you know, love, which Julia describes as, you know, basically like an infection. You know, by the time you realize you've caught it, it's too late. You're like, when did that begin? So I was always asking myself as a kind of a test case, you know, can I make, you know, a grand tragic passion happen in 3 days by creating a circumstance so intense? And I also like when characters meet each other, but they're not focused on their friendship. They're not focused on their relationship. They're so busy. They're looking together at a problem, which is, how do we save these patients? And I love the way they can be interacting very intensely with each other, but not really noticing because they're so focused on their mutual work. So that kind of, you know, wartime bonding, I suppose.
And I must say, I loved the end with and again, not to put another spoiler in case people haven't read the book, but with the baby at the end. You know, that to speak
crucial
to
to
what
add
you're
some
saying about
hope.
that bit of joy, you know?
Oh, I agonized so much over the balance in this book. You know, I literally had a little chart of the patients and how many of the babies would I let survive and how many of the mothers would I let survive. I was a bit like, okay, well, if she lives, I'm sorry, that one there has to die because, you know,
Yeah.
this is a novel about a pandemic. I cannot have everyone be fine.
Yeah, no, there had to be a balance, correct. Now,
Yeah.
we'll take one more. I'm conscious of time.
Oh, let me have a look. The lockdown of 1918, to be honest, they were very sporadic. It depended on the city. For instance, there were two different American cities and one of them locked down seriously and one didn't. And obviously it had much lower death rates as a result. So it was not a consistent or national thing. Let me see. Here's an interesting one. As you become, well, I don't know, do I actually become more accomplished and successful? But I've had a lot of luck in the last 10 years, I would say. Do I feel increased pressure or more creative freedom? To be honest, I feel more creative freedom because I think if your first novel was a huge bestseller and made into a film, I think you'd be like, oh, you know, and you would expect it to always be like that. Whereas
That'd be the bar. The bar would be set high, right? Yeah.
Okay, whereas I know that, first of all, you can write beautiful novels that don't become big hits. And big hits are sometimes rubbish novels. So I'm ruefully aware that, you know, success in the world is not at all the same as quality. And also that the typical publication day is a deeply quiet day in which your editor maybe rings, somebody might send flowers, that's it, nothing else happens. So I know it's not like that every time. So there's no way I'd be expecting myself to pump out the bestsellers. I know that there are random things to do with timing. For instance, The Pull of the Stars has sold so well. In Canada, it's just been sitting on the bestseller list since July. And I know a lot of that is COVID rather than me. So the fact that I only had a gigantic bestseller at the age of 40 really meant my head couldn't be turned by it. You know, and again, my Hollywood experiences were all about the age of 45. And again, I know enough to laugh. So basically, you should put off success until you're middle-aged and you're not likely to have your head turned by it. That's my advice.
Well, and hopefully you'll have a Broadway hit on your hands too.
Well, the thing is, I do love writing for theatre a lot. Yeah. So the Play of Room, which began at the Abbey Theatre and at a theatre in London and one in Scotland. Yet we were on opening night of the North American premiere of that last March 13th when it was cancelled. You know, everybody's lost something. But yeah, I find even though fiction is my very favorite form because I get to, you know, decide everything about it, it's very, you know, isolated business. So getting to work collaboratively and socially in theatre and film, which of course are, you know, banned to me at the moment, but they are the most fun I get to have in my career. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and as a theatre lover, I can't wait for the Broadway adaptation of Room. I look forward to when we finally can get back into the theatres. And it's just, we're coming on the hours. There one more there, Emma, that you want to take
Let me have a look. Brenda gets at the top, says, how long do we have to wait for your next book? I'm writing it as we speak, Brenda. It's not sold yet, so obviously I don't want to jinx it, but I'm writing well. And I've also been writing, I'm trying for the first time in my life, a musical, an actual. Room is a play that had songs added to it, but I've been trying to write a full-blown musical with a composer. So that's very exciting to me. That's, you know, harking back to the subject of the pressures of success. I think one crucial thing to do is to keep trying new things and keep feeling like a beginner, what the Buddhists call the beginner's brain, you know, because you don't want to do any resting on your laurels and saying, oh, I can pump out strange books about little locked up children. Because first of all, you couldn't do a number of those books, could you? No. But also it's just really, you write better if you put yourself in that, you know, blinking newcomer mindset. So since Room the book, trying film and trying writing the children and now trying to write a musical, they've all made me feel really, you know, on my toes.
Well, that's fantastic. And we can't wait. In the meantime, before we get to the Broadway thing, we have your books to enjoy, of course. And I encourage anyone who hasn't read this book or any of Emma's other books to definitely go out, and it's perfect time during COVID to get back into reading. So many people are, and so that's fantastic. Emma, thank you so much for joining us today and providing such insight into your fabulous book. I really, really appreciate it. And we're on the stroke of 7. It brings our session to a close. This is the 7th presentation of our 8-day festival. And tomorrow we wrap up with another wonderful speaker, Dr. Emma O'Toole, Associate Professor of Irish Performance Studies at Concordia University. And Emma will present an academic talk on the history of Irish feminism called Irish Feminism, A Love Story. It starts at 11 a.m. PST, and you can still register at bridgetfestivalvancouver.com. Thank you, of course, to the Consulate General of Ireland in Vancouver and the Immigrant Support Program for their generous support in making this festival possible. Thank you to Maura de Freitas, our festival director, for her vision and creativity in programming the festival. Thank you to the Breed Fest team working behind the scenes to make sure that everything runs smoothly. And in today's case, we have Mary McSwinney to thank. And thank you again to Emma Donoghue for her wonderful presentation. And finally, to all of you who joined us, our listeners today, we hope you enjoyed spending time with us. And finally, we have to mark and celebrate St. Bridget's Day this year, the Department of Foreign Affairs, in partnership with the Museum of Literature Ireland, commissioned 3 new poems by 3 of Ireland's finest female poets, Doreen na Gréofa, Pauline Meehan, and Nidhi Zak, also known as Aria Epp. Accompanying these poems is 3 Poems for Bridget, a series of 3 short online films. Each film showcases a poet and spoken word performer and is based around one of the 3 aspects of Bridget as the triple goddess of poetry, healing, and craft work. Today, we are going to play you out with Imbolic by Nidhi Zak, read by Katrina Ennis. Please enjoy, and thank you for joining us.
Guardian of the fawn, brightest of the flame, awaken us at dawn, O exalted, hear your name. Come glinting in the hearth, coal lashes lined with soot, steel flint, omega arches, fleet mares so light of foot, milk flecked o'er the mouth, skin tight, sweet-lipped foam, suckled at the reddening ears, corners of your cloak, glistening by a winch above the veiled amnion of well. Hold us, head neath water, that we might breathe again. Stay, winter, light the torch, in dark where life is forged. In the belly, draw breath, draw rain.